Today I'd like to talk about the formula that the Buddha used for the development of insight. And this formula, once understood, allows us to see idappaccayanta, specific conditionality. What specific conditionality means is it's the understanding that nothing arises or ceases independent within itself. Whatever we're experiencing now is present because conditions outside of itself are such for it to be so. And whatever we're experiencing now will also cease when the conditions outside of itself change. And this is an important understanding as an insight meditator. It's not enough to just see that things come and go. It's more important to see that they come, that they arise due to specific conditions, and understanding what those conditions are. And also to see and understand that when things cease, it's also due to specific conditions. And as insight meditators, we develop the understanding of why things cease. So why does mindfulness arise within your mind? What's the conditions for that? And what causes your mindfulness to cease? It's an important question, an important understanding. And what causes gross dullness, for example, that sinking mind to arise? And what conditions cause that gross dullness to cease? Very important questions. Very important thing to understand. Idappaccayanta. So in developing insight, it goes way beyond seeing that things come and go, that things arise and cease, and way beyond seeing the anatta, not self-autonomous nature of things. It's a matter of observing in a way that we see change over time. So we start to observe patterns within experience itself. And these patterns, when observed, allow us to understand how it all works. They're just as reliable and trustworthy as the understanding of physics or chemistry. The reason human life can be such a mess is because we don't understand these patterns. We don't trust them. Sometimes we get it right, mostly we get it wrong. So what we'll do is we're going to refer today back to the suttas. We're going to look at the Satipatthana Sutta. So sati is mindfulness, and a patthana is a foundation or a place in which you apply mindfulness towards to develop insight. Yeah? So Satipatthana Sutta, a sutta is a discourse or a talk. This is a talk given by the Buddha. And the Satipatthana Sutta is very different in that it reads as a meditation manual. So what we'll do is we'll unpack certain parts of the Satipatthana Sutta, and then we'll start to notice, start to develop understanding of the patterns within it. And these patterns point towards, they direct towards this formula. Okay, wonderful. I'm just going to start in the Mindfulness of Dhamma section, and what we'll do is we'll just talk about the Four Noble Truths, or what the Buddha had to say about that. And then we'll go earlier in the sutta, and we'll start to reveal patterns that will allow us to understand the Four Noble Truths. And how does a meditator dwell, contemplating Dhamma within Dhammas, in terms of the Four Noble Truths? The meditator knows this is dukkha. They know this is how dukkha arises. They know this is how dukkha ceases. They know this is the path that leads to the cessation of dukkha. So when we're using the Pali word dukkha, dukkha is often translated as suffering, but dukkha can be understood as friction, and various degrees of friction. It can be very, very subtle or very gross. Yeah? So if we take a look at a metaphor, the metaphor of a wheel. Imagine a wheel, and the hub of that wheel and the axle that goes through it don't match. So if you imagine that the hub of the wheel isn't round, it's not formed properly, and so you put the axle through the wheel, and there's no grease in that hub. So when the wheel tries to turn, it grinds, it grates against it. That sort of feeling of grinding or grating. So if it's a little bit deformed, then what happens is the wheel can turn, but there's effort in that turning of the wheel. And that's how we experience dukkha within our life. That feeling of grind, that feeling of friction. But if the hub of that wheel is really distorted and there's no lubrication, then it can be very difficult to turn that wheel at all. You may find it takes a lot of strain, a lot of effort to turn that wheel. So my experience of dukkha within my life was a feeling of walking through deep water up to my throat. And every step is an effort. Every step is a grind. Does that sound familiar? This is the feeling of dukkha. It's that friction, from very subtle friction, from that very subtle discontent. Yeah, that subtle need to actually put effort or striving in, the not quite rightness, up to the blatant levels of anxiety and fear, yeah, that we experience within our life. The feeling of that friction, of that effort being great. The other Pali word is sukha, and we hear that attached to piti. So we hear piti sukha. This is the experience, so piti, the experience of pleasure within our body, and sukha, the happiness, the joy within our mind. So the pleasant feeling comes in our body as a reflection of our state of mind, the state of mind that's born from, developed from, letting go. Yeah. So sukha is an experience of frictionlessness. So no friction is like a wheel, and you have the hub, and the axle goes through the wheel, and it fits perfectly, perfect fit. And the wheel is, or the hub of the wheel is well lubricated with grease. So the lightest touch on the wheel, and the wheel spins freely and effortlessly. No friction, no grind. This is sukha. And we can experience sukha both in samatha, when we're developing calm and tranquility during mindfulness of breathing. We go into periods of sukha, of frictionlessness, of effortlessness. And also we can experience it in dry insight practice. There's times when the mind and heart are letting go, and everything just comes and goes with ease. Our movement becomes easy. Everything becomes effortless. There's no feeling of friction. So we have sukha and dukkha. So the Buddha here in the Four Noble Truths is talking about dukkha. Now, this is dukkha. This is how dukkha arises. This is how dukkha ceases. And this is the path that leads to cessation of dukkha, and that path is the Noble Eightfold Path. Now there's a formula within this. So if we go back earlier in the sutta, we can start to see this formula. So I'll just go, hopefully I'll open up at the right page. Yeah, let's take a look. Okay. In the mindfulness of feeling section, feeling is Vedana, the experience of pleasantness, unpleasantness, and neither. And this can be divided into both worldly and spiritual. We're not going to go into depth into Vedana at this time. But another time we'll do a Dhamma talk just on Vedana because it's so interesting and so important. When we go into the mindfulness of mind section in the Satipatthana Sutta, we have these lines. So we have attraction, aversion, delusion, and then we have different states of mind like distracted, undistracted. Let's see what it says here. When experiencing attraction within their mind, the meditator knows there is attraction present within the mind. When there is no attraction present within the mind, they know there is no attraction present within the mind. And this goes the same for aversion and delusion, undistracted, distracted, exalted, unexalted, and so on. So we can call this recognition. So we recognize the experience that is present to us now. In this case, the experience of attraction, feeling attracted towards something. Now within this we have presence, absence. We can recognize when there is attraction present within our mind. And we can also recognize when there is no attraction present. We can recognize when there's aversion present within our mind. We can recognize when there's no aversion present. Yeah, what does it feel like to not be averse? We recognize when delusion is present and when it's not, and so on. So recognition, presence, absence. Yeah? When we move on to the Mindfulness of Dhamma section, we start to come more into this formula and we'll see it unfold. I'll just turn over to that page now. Okay, wonderful. Oops. Put that over. Okay. In the Mindfulness of Dhamma section, so Mindfulness of Dhamma, so in the Satipatthana Sutta, what we do is we have 4 sections or 4 foundations for mindfulness. And they're kaya, that's the sensations or the experience of our body, and that is tuning into those elemental qualities. We talked about them in a previous talk, didn't we? Yeah. The next one is Vedana. Vedana is the experience of pleasantness, unpleasantness, or neither. Then we have Chitta. Chitta means heart mind. And then we have Dhammas. In original translations, Dhammas was translated as mind objects. But as we look further into this Mindfulness of Dhamma section, we might start to notice that it's pointing towards something else. Mindfulness of Dhammas to me is about iddhapaccayata. It's about specific conditionality. And it's these formulas embedded within it that we're going to reveal that allows us to understand it in that way. So in the Mindfulness of Dhamma section in the Satipatthana Sutta, there's lists such as the 5 hindrances, the 5 aggregates, clung to aggregates, the 6 sense bases, enlightenment factors, and so on. So what we'll do is we'll start to look at these lists, but find the formula that's hidden within them. In the 5 hindrances, these are the hindrances to the development of calm and tranquility. And the 5 hindrances are also the content of insight meditation. And how does a meditator dwell contemplating Dhamma within Dhammas in terms of the 5 hindrances? The Buddha said, when sensual desire is present within them, the meditator knows there is sensual desire present within me. When there is no sensual desire present within them, the meditator knows there is no sensual desire present within me. So recognition, presence, absence. And that's what we saw in the mindfulness and mind section. Yeah, we can see that presence, absence. They also understand how the arising of unarisen sensual desire comes to be, and how to abandon sensual desire once it has arisen. They also understand the conditions for the non-arising of sensual desire once it has been abandoned. Let's unpack this because it's revealing the formula. So, is there sensual desire present within me? You can check now. What does that feel like? Is there no sensual desire present within me? Checking in. What does that feel like? And the same is here for aversion. Yeah. So dullness, sloth and torpor. Restlessness and doubt. Yeah. The next part of that formula, so presence, absence, so recognition. They understand how the arising of unarisen sensual desire comes to be. It's not a matter of noticing that sensual desire arises and ceases. The Buddha's saying the meditator understands the conditions for sensual desire to arise. You might be experiencing sensual desire now, but what were the conditions for it to arise, to be here? What caused it to arise? It's not enough just to see arising. It's important to observe, to track experience over time, to see patterns, to see relationships, to understand these conditions. Presence, absence, so that's recognition. Understanding the conditions for this to arise. Remember, this is applied to aversion and all the other hindrances. And then he says, and how to They also understand how the arising of unarisen sensual desire comes to be, and how to abandon sensual desire once it has arisen. So it's understanding, once we notice it's arisen, do we understand the conditions for it to cease? So we understand the conditions, so we recognize sensual desire. We understand, or we develop insight into and understand the conditions for it to arise. And then we develop an understanding for the conditions for it to cease. So it's not just noticing that things cease. It's also understanding idappaccayanta, specific conditionality. What are the conditions that cause sensual desire to cease within you? What are the conditions that cause aversion to cease within you? Dullness to cease within you? Yeah? Doubt to cease within you, and so on. Recognition, presence, absence, conditions for it to arise, conditions for it to cease. They also understand the conditions for the non-arising essential desire once it has been abandoned. So apply the conditions the sensual desire to cease in a way so that it becomes weak and so that it no longer arises within you again. So we have the four things: recognition, number one, understanding the conditions for it to arise, the conditions for it to cease, and understanding how to apply the conditions for it to cease and bring it to an end. Let's see if this continues in the Mindfulness of Dhamma section of the Satipatthana Sutta. If I go to the next part, let's look at this formula again. The 5 clung to aggregates. And it's important to understand that these aggregates themselves are not a problem. They are not dukkha. But when associated with clinging, with grasping, they're dukkha. And how does a meditator dwell contemplating Dhamma within Dhammas in terms of the 5 clung to aggregates? The meditator knows this is form, this is its arising, this is its cessation. This is feeling, this is its arising, this is its cessation. So we go form, feeling, perception, formations, awareness. That same formula. Now this is really interesting. It's really interesting because we could think, this is form, arising, ceasing. But we've started to see a formula here. We're starting to understand what this means. So recognition. Can you recognize the experience of form, of experience of feeling, the experience of perception, and so on? Can you recognize the conditions for it to arise? What are the conditions? Can you recognize the conditions for it to cease? Now notice in this, the 4th section, apply the conditions for it to cease, doesn't exist. And why is that? Why do you think we don't apply the conditions for form to cease, for feeling to cease, for perception to cease? Yes, that's right, because they're not dukkha. It's the clinging, it's the craving, it's the attachment to these 5 things that's dukkha. It's that we apply the conditions to cease. These are just ordinary everyday things. They're all part of this existence. They're not a problem at all. The suffering comes about because of the clinging. And it's the release of that very craving that we're looking at as insight meditators. But if you see, it's the same formula. Recognition, conditions for it to arise, conditions for it to cease. But that last line, the 4th one, is not applied here. The Buddha then applies this to that clinging, to that craving in the next section, in the Mindfulness of Dhammas section in the Satipatthana Sutta. Okay, 6 internal and external sense bases. Basically, that's just your 6 senses. Your 5 physical sense and your mind as a sense door. Okay. And how does a meditator dwell contemplating Dhamma within Dhammas in terms of the 6 internal and external sense bases? The meditator knows the eye, knows sights, and understands the attachment that arises dependent on both. So eye, a sight, and an attachment that arises depending on both of those being present. Now notice the focus isn't on the eye and the sight. It's on the attachment, the clinging, the craving. So recognition. And we could say recognition in terms of presence of that craving or absence of that craving. They know how the arising of unarisen attachment comes to be. So they understand the conditions for that attachment to the idol to arise. Yeah? They understand the conditions for it to arise. Again, it's not about it arising. It's about understanding the conditions for it to arise. And they know how to abandon the attachment once it has arisen. So they understand how to change the conditions that support that attachment so it will cease. Starting to see a pattern, recognition, conditions, understanding conditions for it to arise, understanding the conditions for it to cease. They also understand the conditions for the non-arising of attachment once it has been abandoned. And what that means is once we understand these conditions for it to arise and cease, we can apply the conditions for it to cease and bring that craving, bring that attachment to an end. Yeah, now we're starting to see a path. Now this applies to the eye, the ear, the nose, tongue, body, and mind. Yeah? Fantastic. Wonderful. Let's see if this continues. What do you think? What are we going to find? The 7 factors of awakening. Yeah? Now, when we're talking about the 7 factors of awakening, what we're talking about is kusala experiences. So before we were talking about akusala. So akusala is unwholesome, unskillful, and kusala is wholesome, skillful. So as insight meditators, we need to develop understanding of the akusala and weaken them and bring them to an end. Change the conditions so they can no longer arise. And we want to develop understanding of the kusala and cultivate them, grow them, strengthen them so they become our natural expression, our natural way of being. So how does he apply this formula to the 7 factors of awakening? When mindfulness as an awakening factor is present within them, the meditator knows mindfulness as an awakening factor is present within me. When mindfulness as an awakening factor is not present within them, the meditator knows there is no mindfulness as an awakening factor present within me. Presence, absence. So this is about recognition. Getting to know, to recognize this experience here. What we're talking about is we're talking about the experience of mindfulness itself. And in the awakening factors, we're talking about mindfulness, investigation, which I call curiosity, balanced effort, joy, tranquility, unification, most commonly called samadhi these days, which is the Pali word, and equanimity. Those 7 factors. Yeah. So when we take a look at these 7 factors, we start to notice recognition, presence, absence. The meditator knows how the arising of unarisen mindfulness as an awakening factor comes to be. So understanding the conditions that cause mindfulness to arise within your mind. Do you know the conditions? Can you create those conditions at will? Yeah, see how active? It's not just about arising and ceasing. What are the conditions that cause mindfulness to arise? And once arisen, mindfulness as awakening factor reaches maturity for cultivation. So they understand how once arisen, mindfulness as awakening factor reaches maturity through cultivation. Now notice the change in the formula here. Recognition, presence, absence. Understand the conditions for mindfulness to arise. Then apply the conditions for it to arise and establish. Notice the third part of this formula, ceasing, is missing. I find this really interesting. So we can see when it comes to the kusala, the wholesome, the skillful, the Buddha says, recognize it. Is curiosity present within me? Is it absent? What are the conditions for curiosity to arise? Investigation. Well, apply those conditions. Allow it to grow. What are the conditions that will actually allow curiosity to grow and establish and become a natural expression of my heart and mind? Yeah, like that. This is one of the areas that I'd love to have a chat with the Buddha about. I have so many questions. I'd love to sit down and ask about that, why that third factor of that formula is missing. The way I teach in MIDL is this. Observe the conditions, get to understand the conditions for mindfulness to arise. But also observe and understand the conditions for mindfulness to cease. Anything that is kusala, wholesome and skillful, we should not only understand what causes it to arise, but also what causes it to collapse, to cease. If we understand that, then we understand better how to create the conditions for it to grow, to cultivate, and establish. Yeah, so that formula applies there. Very interesting. Let's see if this continues. The last part of the Mindfulness of Dhamma section in the Satipatthana Sutta as the Four Noble Truths. So we're returning to what we started with. Let's read this formula again and see if we can understand it. Because when this formula is presented here, all these other variances of the same formula have been applied, have been presented. Now, if we notice it, it's not about the lists. It's about the formula embedded within those lists. It's as if the Buddha was asked, how do I apply that formula? And the Buddha says, well, you apply that formula to the hindrances in this way. You apply it to the aggregates in this way, to the sense bases in this way, the enlightenment factors in this way. So they're actively discussing or putting down, this is how you apply it. But the one theme all the way through is that formula. Recognition, conditions for it to arise, understand the conditions for it to cease, and then apply the conditions for it to cease if it's akusala, unwholesome, unskillful, or apply the conditions for it to arise and establish if it's kusala, wholesome, skillful. Yeah, we're starting to see. And how does a meditator dwell contemplating Dhamma within Dhammas in terms of the Four Noble Truths? The meditator knows this is dukkha. They know this is how dukkha arises. They know this is how dukkha ceases. They know this is the path that leads to cessation of dukkha. Now suddenly we can start to see the formula in the Four Noble Truths is the same formula in all the other things in the Mindfulness of Dhamma section. And also we find it in the Mindfulness of Feeling and Mindfulness of Mind section as well, but in abbreviation. So in those sections it's just recognition, learning to notice when something is present, and as well noticing when something is absent. But then it's expounded, it's spread out. So we understand idappaccayata, specific conditionality. The meditator knows this is dukkha, recognition. We can actually open this up to apply that same formula. We recognize dukkha, but can we recognize its presence and its absence? What is the experience of dukkha when it's present within us? What is the experience of dukkha when it's absent within us? Yeah, can you notice? Can you notice those two? Not only in seated practice, but also throughout the day. Presence, absence, recognition. They know this is how dukkha arises. So we often hear this formula, dukkha, arising, ceasing, path. Yeah? It's not about arising and ceasing. This is an abbreviation of the formula, but it's not just noticing that things come and go. It's about noticing the conditions that cause things to come and conditions that cause things to go. It's not just about arising and ceasing. It's about tracking arising over time to see patterns. It's about tracking ceasing over time to see patterns. Yeah? Conditions are changing. That's what causes arising. Conditions are changing. That's what causes ceasing. So they know this is how dukkha arises. They know the conditions for dukkha to arise. They know this is how dukkha ceases. They know the conditions for dukkha to cease. Important. They know this is the path that leads to cessation of dukkha. And then the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the first talk given by the Buddha, setting the wheel of Dharma in motion. That's why I used a wheel metaphor before. The Buddha actually introduces the path that leads to the cessation of dukkha as the Noble Eightfold Path. Yeah, the Noble Eightfold Path. And the Noble Eightfold Path is embedded in the practice of MIDL. Yeah, so we can see that. So this is applying the conditions for dukkha to cease. Recognition, presence, absence. Understand the conditions for this experience to arise. The conditions for this experience to cease. Apply the conditions. So as we can see, this same formula, this 4-step formula can be applied to anything and everything, and it should be. In the previous talk, we deconstructed and broke down experience. In this one, we look at the formula that we apply to that. Now, for those of you that are familiar with MIDL, with practicing mindfulness in daily life, yeah, you'll be familiar with the GOS formula. Ground, observe, soften, smile. Grounding, developing mindfulness of body as a reference point. We do that from relaxing, letting go. Observing and noticing the conditions, observing the conditions for your mind to wander. Yeah? Observing the conditions for attraction, aversion, delusion to arise in your mind. Observing the conditions for the enlightenment factors to arise within your mind. So it can be applied to akusala or kusala. And then soften, relax, letting go. We let go of effort. It's the softening, relaxing, letting go of effort that changes the conditions that support things. Anything that is akusala, unwholesome, unskillful, rests on a bed of effort, of grasping, grabbing onto. So softening, relaxing that effort, letting it go, makes it weaken. Yeah? Anything that's based on kusala, wholesome or skillful, yeah, is available on that very letting go, that very release. Love and kindness and gentleness and gratitude become stronger when we soften, relax into them, when we let go. This opens up the path as a path of letting go, a path of noticing where we cling, and a path of releasing that clinging and enjoying, finding the pleasure of letting it go, putting it down. Finding that joy, that pleasure in inclining towards the kusala, the wholesome, the skillful. Yeah, bringing them up within our mind, cultivating them. Yeah. So whenever we soften, relax off akusala, if we focus on the pleasure of that letting go, we strengthen and develop the kusala, that love, that kindness, that caring, that gratitude, that generosity, etc. Wonderful.